Well, good afternoon, good evening, Charles Metcalfe, directly from Sussex. Hello.
Good afternoon.
And good afternoon, Poland. So we start another look at the Alentejo with Charles Metcalfe, or if he's there, Charles Metcalfe. Yeah, very well. Charles, the floor is yours, and let's start.
Great. Thank you very much indeed, Piotr. We tasted some wines and we had a presentation. It was in the depths of last year, I think. And we tasted some wonderful wines from the Alentejo, and the tasting went well, and the reaction was good. And so the Alentejo people decided it'd be good to do another one with different wines. So this time we have the same place, the same part of Portugal. This is a nice little Portuguese flag for us. We have the same part of Portugal, same big wine region, but we have different wines from the ones we used last time. Now, as you can see, just a few numbers to start with. The Alentejo makes up very nearly 30% of the entire area of Portugal. It's easily the biggest landmass in Portugal in terms of wine regions. And so, but in terms of hectares, as you can see down there, 21,989 hectares, which is 11% of Portugal's vineyard area. The other one, which is pretty big, is the Douro Valley. The Douro has a lot of vineyards, and they are more densely planted than the Alentejo is. So that actually makes more wine at the moment than the Alentejo. But the Alentejo has lots of things to offer. It's a very beautiful part of Portugal. It has not just wine, but it has cork oaks. It has more cork oaks in the Alentejo than anywhere else. And this is a rather wonderful picture, courtesy of Amorim, which is the largest producer of cork in Portugal. And of course, Portugal itself is the largest producer of cork in the world. And here's a wonderful picture of a cork oak just after the bark has been stripped. So you've got this wonderful, rich red color of the inside after the bark has been removed. You can see the branches right at the top. The cork is not thick enough, and they haven't taken the cork off those branches, but it's those central lower branches where they strip off the cork, and they can do that basically once every 9 or 10 years. So it's a slow growing tree, and it can only be harvested, the cork from this, once every 10 years. Then you just have to wait for it to regrow. But as well as cork, they also have cattle. They have a wonderful breed of beef called carne alentejano, Alentejano meat, literally, and that is a picture of a very attractive cow waiting her fate to be made into steaks or whatever. And they also have sheep, which they use for wool, of course, but also for their meat. And particularly for their milk, because there are some of Portugal's best cheeses are made from sheep's milk, which is great if, like my wife, you are not able to drink cow's milk or goat's milk, but can drink sheep's milk. And so Catherine, my wife, is very happy that she can eat sheep's milk cheeses and yogurts and requeijão, which is what the Italians would call ricotta. So sheep there are in plenty, and there are also black pigs. The great black pig of southern Portugal, that is porco preto alentejano, as it says in the little caption. That is the great source of pork meat, and also not just to eat without having been cured, but salted and cured pork meat. And that makes wonderful, what the Spanish would call jamón, the Portuguese call presunto, and there are various producers of this porco preto, this black pig, who slaughter their animals and then send them to Spain to be turned into jamón, and then get them back from Spain, because the Spanish are particularly talented at turning the pig meat into wonderful cured ham. And then a lot of the countryside is taken up by these two crops here. You may think, what's the crop? We've got trees there, which are olive trees, and olive trees give us olives and, of course, olive oil, particularly extra virgin olive oil, of which Portugal is a very fine supply and makes particularly wonderful olive oil. But in between the trees, you've got cereals planted. And wheat in particular is a very important cereal and has historically been very important for the Portuguese economy for the making of bread. So there you have two different agricultural products just in one photo, and eventually we come to wine. So here we are, some pictures of wines, the town of Estremoz at the top, and then a man plunging what looks like a plastic container of grapes to get the juice out of the skins, then a modern winery with lots of stainless steel tanks, and then the old way of doing things, these clay pots, which in Portugal are called talhas. A talha is one of these clay pots. They use them, as you probably know, they use them also in Georgia, where they're called kvevri, and they use them in other places, a little bit in Spain. But in Portugal, there is a real revival of wines being made in these clay pots. Okay, so there's the wine. What are the factors that influence the wines of the Alentejo? Well, it's a Mediterranean climate, and it's worth pointing out that it's not on any side borders. It doesn't border the Mediterranean at all. It's actually on the west side of Portugal and the north side of Portugal. It's the Atlantic, and then when you turn the south and the east, it's borders with Spain. So it's nothing to do with the Mediterranean Sea, ocean, whichever. It's the climate of the Mediterranean, which is very similar to the climate you find in most of Portugal. Soils, tremendous variety of soils, a lot of Portuguese terroir, as you might say if you're using the French word, is rock of various different kinds. Rock, particularly in the north and the east of Portugal, it's granite, granito. And that, this very hard rock, wonderful for if you want to make a kitchen surface in your kitchen. But granito it's also very interesting because it's quite a cold soil because it reflects the sun. It doesn't soak up the sun's rays and become hot. It reflects the sun back out. And so it's actually quite a cool rock. But as well as that, you've got schist, which is the great soil of the port part of the Douro Valley in the north of Portugal. Schist, otherwise known as slate, that does the opposite of to what granite does, because schist will soak up the sun and get very hot. And so even after the sun has gone down through the night, you've still got that warmth radiating up onto the vines, carrying on ripening. Grape varieties, there is a huge number of about 300 different grapes varieties that are grown in Portugal, and many of them have names that you really will not find in other countries. There are some grape varieties that are shared with Spain. Tempranillo of Spain, for instance, is a good example. In Portugal, it has two different names. In the Alentejo, which is where we are at the moment, of course, it's Aragonés. But in the north of Portugal, they call it Tinta Roriz. So same grape, two names, confusing. Viticulture and winemaking also play a very important part. And more so, I think there's a concentration on viticulture as being a way you can really affect the ripening of your grapes. Or if you live in a very hot place, you can shade them to stop the grapes ripening quite as fast as they might otherwise do, and indeed over-ripening in some cases. So it's a very important way of dictating how you grow your vines. Then the climate, which is so important, typically Mediterranean, cooler to the rest because it's near the Atlantic, and hotter and drier to the east and south. The east is interesting because you've got a spine of mountains that runs down the east coast, which of course is contiguous with Spain on the eastern side of Portugal. you've got Spain. And so the Spanish border runs contiguous with Portugal. And down there, you've got a spine of mountains, which, of course, gives you more altitude, which cools down the temperature. But it also means that you've got these rock formations, particularly granite. So that cools it down. But then, on the other hand, the weather gets hotter as you get further inland, further away from the Atlantic. So the weather gets hotter, and the temperatures rise, and you're more likely to get very ripe grapes. Temperatures can fall to 9 degrees in winter. And, to be perfectly honest, I live in a town not far from the city of Coimbra, which is in the central north of Portugal. And I have to say that we lost 2 very beloved trees that we had brought with us from England to Portugal in the first winter we were there. And the temperature fell to about -5. Nothing for Poland, I know, but for Portugal, it was a disaster, and we lost these 2 trees. So it says temperatures can fall to 9 degrees. That's talking about the Alentejo, which is further south and warmer and doesn't get so cold in the winter. But in the summer, on the other hand, you can regularly get temperatures over 40 degrees. Hottest temperature ever recorded, as far as I'm aware, was in 2003, which of course was a very hot year, getting pretty close to 50 degrees. It's very dry, but there is this Alentejo dam which has been built, and that does give quite a lot of water. When I was last driving through the Alentejo, which I was in October, I have to say we were quite short of rain throughout Portugal through this summer, and the dams were pretty low. There was not a lot of water in the dams. Okay, so a quick look at the map. Now, so these are the viticultural areas of Portugal. To the left, you have to imagine the Atlantic. To the right, what looks like a coast is in fact the coast of Spain, so to speak. It's the border with Spain. And the Alentejo is this large brown area around the sort of center and the bottom of this map. You've got this pale blue area, which is the bottom of the peninsula of Setúbal, but all that brown area is Alentejo before you get to the yellow area at the bottom, which is the Algarve. Now, the darker brown areas, those are the parts of the Alentejo where you can make wines which you can classify as denominação de origem controlada, so controlled denomination of origin. The paler brown, you can make wine there, but you will never be able to call it by a DOC label because it's just not in the historic regions of the Alentejo, historic wine regions of the Alentejo. But having said that, there are many wonderful wines, Vinhos Regionais, regional wines, which are made either in these paler brown areas or else they don't quite obey the rules that the DOC regulations stipulate. And so they qualify as regional wines, but not as DOC wines. Okay, so then we delve a bit further into the various regions of the Alentejo, and you can see these are the different sub-regions of the Alentejo. Up in the north, you have Porto Alegre, which is, it's well north of Lisbon. And when you look at this map, it just shows you how much of the Alentejo is taken up, how much of the land mass of Portugal is taken up by the Alentejo. So the number one, Porto Alegre, which is very granite, it's quite mountainous. Number two, you're coming down a bit into Borba, you're getting into marble soils. Redondo, again, richer soils, and away from the granite mostly. Evora, Regengues coming down, and you're coming down, and as you come down, number 6, Granja, Malaysia, you're getting into really quite hot country. And by the time you get to Vidigueira, you'd think this was the hottest of these subregions. But there is a strange phenomenon. There is a range of mountains which has a channel straight through from the Atlantic Ocean into the east part of Portugal, which is Vidigueira. And that actually means that you can, historically, there's a great reputation for producing white wines in Vidigueira because there is this curious channel of cold air that comes through. Okay, enough generally. I think what I wanted to make the point now, just before we start on our first wine, which is a white wine from a company called Adega Mayor. I just wanted to make the point that the Alentejo has made a big thing about a program of sustainability for wines and viticulture, which was put into place, I think, eventually it was finalized. It started in 2020, and all sorts, it's totally voluntary. No one has to sign up to it, but it is the first Portuguese wine region that has actually put this qualification into place. It's tough and involves all sorts of different kinds of aspects of sustainability, not just how you do your viticulture, how you use your water, what you do with your waste, but also aspects of looking after the population, making sure there's enough jobs for people. It's a very thorough classification, which was done by a great guy called João Barroso. But so far, 20 companies have signed up and are certified. And I'm sure that more will follow on. And I'm also sure that other wine regions are going to put their own programs of certification of sustainability into place, because it is so important now in our warming climate where things are changing so fast and the weather patterns are changing. We need to try and take things as gently as possible, look after nature, look after growing things, living things in general. And this program of sustainability does that very well. Okay, wine number one, Verdelho. So Verdelho is one of the great white grapes of that's grown originally in Madeira, which is an island. If I were to go back to the, it's a bit confusing because Madeira, you see that red area off the west of the coast of Portugal. That's not where it is. It's off the coast of Morocco, frankly. So Madeira is a long way away, but it's one of the great white grapes of Madeira. There are five of these really. There's Cercial, Verdelho, Boal, Malvasia, and another one which is much less planted, which is called Alentejo. Those are the four great white grapes of Madeira, and they make some of probably most of the really fine wines of Madeira. But the grape which is most planted is actually a black grape called Tinta Negra Mole, which translates roughly as black soft. And most of what's planted in Madeira, as far as grafted vines, are made of this Tinta Negra Mole. But the five white grapes make some of the finest vintage wines, which are virtually ageless. Anyway, so this is one of those grapes, but this time it's planted for Adega Mayor, which is in the sort of quite in the north of the Alentejo, not quite as far north as Porto Alegre, but a bit south of that. It's a fascinating company. It was started by a man called Rui Nabeiro, and you see his picture there on the left of the picture, with his granddaughter, who is now the CEO of the company, because Adega Mayor is part of a larger group of Grupo Nabeiro, which also owns and is the main part of the company. It owns Delta Coffee, which is Portugal's largest coffee company. They don't grow the coffee themselves in Portugal, but they import from all over the place, all the places you'd expect to find coffee imported from, particularly Brazil. But Adega Mayor it's a great company. I had a visit round not so long ago when I was last down there, and I was really impressed by their attitude towards their workforce. It really seemed to be just one big family working positively together. They had a wonderful place called a coffee science museum, where one of the things you could do was climb inside a large metal container, a sort of oval metal container, and enough which was made out of one of the old coffee roasters that is now no longer used, but used to be used. You climbed inside this metal container. You could fit 30 people inside. And then they pretended that they were roasting you and slightly warmed the temperature and told you what would happen to a coffee bean while it was roasting. But it was a fascinating visit to this Coffee Science Museum. And I really thoroughly suggest if any of you is in that part of Portugal, it's worth a visit. They do very good visits to the Adega anyway, to the winery, and do go and see this Coffee Science Museum. At the end of the visit, there was a really good barista who did amazing things with coffee, including making a frozen coffee, which was actually delicious. Okay, anyway, here we are with the first wine that we've got, and this one. So here's the slide up on the screen. So that shows us a picture of the bottle, and as you can see, it's quite low alcohol. It's a white wine. They're not looking for high alcohol. They're looking for crispness. They're looking for acidity. They're looking for freshness. And so you've got this 12% alcohol, 5.1 grams of acidity per liter, and that's which is quite high. Altitude not particularly high, 260 meters, but up a bit. Natural yeasts means they don't actually add yeast; they just wait for the natural yeasts that grow on the vines to start the fermentation, and then they take it over and they do a controlled fermentation in stainless steel. And it has 6 months on the lees in steel tanks. So there is absolutely no oak involved in this wine. It's fresh, it's bright, it gives you the flavor of the wine. And I always think that Verdelho is a grape that it has a sort of aspect of grassy greenness to it. It's quite high acid. There's a I think that's tremendous. Bright, fresh, good acidity, very. It really wakes up the palate. I skipped lunch today, so this is the first thing I've had in my mouth since breakfast, and coffee. I think it's a tremendous wine. Just imagine this, a glass of this with, gosh, how much? I mean, what? Any kind of seafood. Possibly not the sort of richer kinds of seafood like crabs and lobsters, but a grilled fish, a fresh grilled fish, or a plate of prawns cooked with garlic. I think this would be an absolutely delightful wine. So that's wine number one. Probably give me a little less next time, my dear. Thank you. I've got my daughter who's very kindly being a sommelier for me today. Let's move on then. Wine number two.
Charles,
winery. Yes, Piotr.
There's a question in chat. What about sushi? Because you kindly answered.
Sushi, good idea. Very good idea. I tend to find with sushi, and we're very lucky living where we do, that we have a very good sushi restaurant. Not that far from where we live, and we quite often go and have sushi there. And I'm always looking for a bright, fresh, crisp white wine to go with sushi. And I think that would fit the bill really well. Sushi, good idea. Great suggestion. Thank you. Okay, moving on to Adega do Monte Branco. This one, we have a young man, and he really is quite a young man. I mean, I'm now that I'm getting very ancient, but he started very early. He was born and raised in the Alentejo. His father is also a winemaker, and makes very good wines, Quinta de Mouro. And there was a point at which Luis, I'd been helping him for a long time, Luis Louro, and he, after have helped his dad for quite a while, he thought, I would like to start my own place. And so he built this very sort of understated, lean, sort of straight lines adega. And he started his business when he was 23, which is pretty brave to start your own business, I think, at that stage. So Adega de Monte Branco, and as it suggests, it's near Estremoz, which is one of the great hillside cities along the east of Portugal. Hillside cities because they were built to keep out the marauding Spaniards. When the marauding Spaniards used to come in and attack the Portuguese, now, of course, they're all good friends. And when the Spaniards come to Portugal, they come as tourists and they buy all sorts of good things, including the wines. Anyway, so that is Luis with not his wife, but his winemaker. He's got an assistant winemaker called which she's called Capau is Inej Capao. And between them, every year, they have a competition to see which of the two of them can make a small volume production of a bottle of a wine where they cooperate to make the best wine they can. And they call it Louca, which is Louca. So Lou from the first three letters of Luis's name, which is Louro, Louro, and Ka from the first two letters of Inej's name, which is Capao, which actually also means capon, if you're aware of capon, which is it's a castrated male chicken, which is sometimes prized in certain cuisines because they get when they've lost their useful bits, they get very fat and they get very delicious and tender, and they're eaten in certain parts of the world, particularly France. Actually, I wonder why that could be. Particularly France, they eat quite a lot of chapon, capons. Anyway, that's Inej, and then they have this competition to make a wine between them. But the main label that Luis uses is this label Alentejo, which is quite a nice play on Alentejano, Alentejo, and there's the suggestion of slight slowness. Lento means slow. So here they are in Estremoz. Which has got this extraordinary marble soils. I'm not saying that all of the soils are marble, but they do have two different vineyards either side of the winery, around about 400 plus meters. So as you 380 for this wine, and they have two different soils because you've got the schist soils of the Serra d'Ossa, and then you've got some different soils around Sozel, which are those marble soils. And so you can play around and blend the grapes from different things. Here you've got two Portuguese grape varieties, and one is a very particular and specific famous grape of the Alentejo, which is the Antavage. Now the Antavage, which is actually represents about 30% of the blend. 70% of the blend is Arinto. Arinto is a grape which was first isolated just north of Lisbon in a region called Bucelas. And that's where it first comes from. It's now grown almost all over Portugal because it's very fresh, very crisp, very steely. Antavage is richer and fuller and gives really interesting wines when you do a bit of barrel fermentation. So this one you see is fermented in quite large French oak barrels. And Luis said he deliberately chooses larger oak barrels because he doesn't want the influence of the oak to be too strong. He wants to give some of the roundness from fermenting in oak, but not for the wine to taste completely of oak. So it's just got a gentle sort of creamy richness to it, which I was very, very taken by this when I tried it. It's got mostly, don't forget, you've got this 70% steely Arinto. You could really feel that steely acidity underneath, can't you? But it's got this sort of slightly creamy overtone. You know, I think given half a chance, which it won't be today, this bottle, I think this bottle would probably sit in somebody's cellar perfectly happily and evolve for another probably up to 5 years. And I think it would turn out very well and turn into you'd get more of that richness, and the acidity would slightly fade into the background. I'm not saying it changes, but it's I think the answer to, I see someone's asked a question about whether it was new oak or used oak, and I think the answer is that they've got a bit of both, because as many winemakers are finding, the effect of fermenting a wine in an oak barrel is a very useful one, and it can soften and round off some of the edges, particularly, of course, for red wines, but also for white wines. And but you don't want to have too strong an oak character. And Luis, he will have the odd new oak barrel when he needs to, but he's also keen to hold on to his older oak and keep on using them for as long as possible, because that will give that gentle richness of fermentation, without too much flavor of all those flavors of the vanilla flavors, and almost sometimes a kind of rummy flavor that you can get from using oak in fermentation. And likewise, not too high a toast. So I think this is it's oaked, but it's not oaked in an obvious way that you think I'm sucking a plank. It's a gentle oaking rather than anything too much. I've seen my notes here. It makes the point that Estremadura is a good place for whites because it's got a very good aquifer underneath the Estremadura area, and you've got a lot of water in the subsoil. So that even though it can be very hot in the Alentejo, this aquifer running under Estremadura really means that there's a continual availability of water for vines, and so you can keep ripening the grapes without them drying out and getting stressed. 70% of the wine they make at Adega de Montbranco is exported. Places, I don't know that they've got Poland on their list yet. Canada, Belgium, Germany, USA, Brazil, a little bit, but I think not yet Poland. So maybe if you like this would be a good wine to go for. And it's actually 14 to 16 euros a bottle. It's possibly more than some you'll eat in Poland, but in the context of the tasting that we're doing today, it's one of the less expensive wines. Great. Okay, let's move on to our next wine. And here we move to Casa Clara, which, by the way, was one of the first wineries to be certified under this sustainability program. So they were being very, very good about getting on with that. It's owned by a family called Roch Duval, and Carlos and Clara, mum and dad, and the daughter Mariana, who is the one you see in the photograph on the left, walking between the vines, as opposed to the enologist, who is walking in the vines on the other side, who's called Alexandra Mendes. And she was the one who gave me the tasting when I went there, and I was very impressed. I thought, this is a woman who's making good wines. She really knows what she's talking about. And there you see, look at that lake there. I can't remember if it's a river or a lake, but it's towards the south of the Alentejo, and they've got two specifically different estates, one called Dona Maria, one called Herdade de Capella. And as you will see, what they've showed us here is their Monte de Capella, the Reserva Branco, the white reserve. Again, 12.5 alcohol. We're not looking for high alcohol here. We're looking for freshness, for brightness, for drinkability. You don't want your white wines to be too heavy and rich and thick and alcoholic. And so I think one of the things that I hope you take away from this is that as well as making wines up in the northwest of Portugal, we did a session, if you probably remember, some of you, when you saw and tasted our wines from Vinha Verde not long ago. They make some very good whites in the south of Portugal as well. You have to be quite careful about which area you choose, but if you get the right area with enough water underneath and not too hot a climate, you can make some cracking whites. And here we've got a wine which is made from a combination of the three different grapes that we've already tasted. We started with the Verdelho. Well, this one has some Verdelho. It's only got 5% Verdelho, but 65% Arinto. If you remember, the last wine was 70% Arinto. So this very fresh, steely wine, a great variety which can really keep its acidity, which is why it's so important and so useful nowadays in this time of a warming climate. And then in the middle, you've got the Antavage, this very much an Alentejo grape. 30% of that, yeah, 30% of that and that is the one which gives the richness and the fullness and the fruitiness. So you've got this little touch of green, grassy Vidalia completing the blend. 200 meters, so not very high, but it's further south, and it's on limestone, which is quite unusual for the Alentejo, and tends to give very fresh, bright wines, and fermented in stainless steel, and then one third only of this wine aged for 3 months in French oak. So they're really not looking to make a big statement about oak here. They're wanting the wine to show, and you'll be able to taste the wine, and not just too much oak. There's got a nice rounded oak on the nose. And you can just feel it's a slightly softer, richer start. It's still got that wonderful Arinto acidity, and that little tiny touch of grassiness from the 5% Vidalia. But it's rounded more because it's a slightly but further. It comes from further south, and so it's a bit warmer down there. And nice finish too, 2019. So it's still hanging on. I would say I would drink this today, but you could probably keep it there for another couple of years, and it will get a little bit softer and rounder as it ages. But basically, it's a lovely wine, very well made, and I think it will go on for another couple of years. But grab it now, don't wait too long. I have lost more pleasure, I have to say, leaving wine too long in my cellar rather than drinking them too early. What do I want to say otherwise about this? Oh yes, just making the point that they're down in Vidigueira, whereas I mentioned this earlier. There is this east-west facing escarpment, this sort of hill, which actually makes the character, and it provides this channel for the cold air that comes through from the Atlantic to what would otherwise be really quite a hot region. So that Vidigueira escarpment is very much where we are now. I'm just reaching for my next set of notes, and we move on to Corte de Cima. Corte de Cima is it's a fascinating winery, and it's getting more interesting as it goes on. It was started by the couple you see in the middle of the photo, Hans and Carrie Jorgensen. Hans is Danish, and Carrie is American. Their daughter, Anna, is in the middle. And recently, Hans and Carrie decided they would retire. And so they've handed over to Anna. She's done a lot of study all around the world. Where's she been? She's worked in University of Adelaide. She worked in California and New Zealand and in France. So she's had a lot of international experience, but she's a Vidigueira girl. And I remember when we went to see her, we didn't see her, but I saw a little video she'd made, and she was so passionate about the place where she grew up, this place Vidigueira, and the olives that right next to their vineyard. There's a large olive plantation, and life is changing in the south of Portugal, and a lot of olive trees are being planted. I think quite a lot of them by Spanish entrepreneurs, and I'm slightly worried, and so are many of the Alentejo, because they're being intensively planted with very little space between the different olive trees, in great long rows. I mean, long rows that stretch for miles and miles, kilometers and kilometers. But this intensive plantation needs a lot of water, and a lot of water is not really what the Alentejo has, particularly the south of the Alentejo, because here we are in the south of the Alentejo, and it's pretty hot down there. And down in Vidigueira, they may have a cool enough climate to make nice white wines and very good reds, but it's pretty darn hot. So what Anna did, she went to the vineyard next door, the olive grove next door, who were about to rip out all their beautiful old olive trees. and said, look, I'll buy the land off you. I'll buy it and I'll farm it and I'll keep these trees. And they said, no, sorry, we don't want you to do that. We want to rip out these trees and plant new ones, young ones. They'll be much easier to harvest. You'll be able to harvest them mechanically. We have an investment we want to make, and I'm sorry, we are not selling this land to you. Eventually, she managed to persuade them not to sell her the land, but to sell her the trees. So not all of them, but quite a lot of those old olive trees, some of them hundreds of years old, they were able to dig up and replant on Corte de Sima land. And they had to cut them right back, prune them right back. So I saw them not long after they'd been replanted, about, I think it was in August that they had to replant, and I was there in October. But all the trees were already sprouting new green leaves. And I sort of breathed a sigh of relief, because I thought, here's a woman who had the courage to do this, which they might have all died, but she had the courage to do this. And the result is that she saved these beautiful old trees, which otherwise would have been, if not thrown on the scrap heap, they would have been burnt, or maybe they would have been sold to people to make sculptures out of with this beautiful old olive wood. But anyway, they were saved. And the other thing that Carrie is doing, she's decided that although her mum and dad, they built up their company to be sort of, they were small to start with, and then they grew to a sort of medium size, and then they got sort of medium large. Anna has decided she wants to go smaller. So she's taking out some of the vines, she's keeping the parts that she really likes, and she's taken a lot of advice from a wonderful soil viticultural expert called Pedro Parra, who I met in Chile, where he digs holes in the ground and looks very closely at the soils and the soil profiles, and then tells Chileans what they should be planting there. Anyway, Anna had obviously come across him by renown, because he works now all over the world, not just in Chile, and she's enlisted his help to dig holes in her ground to find out what he should be planting. And the result is that, having been a winery that very much specialized in growing Syrah, that was the main grape variety that Hans and Carrie used to grow, because they thought, they've got quite a lot of granite soil there, and Syrah works on granite in the northern Rhone, in places like Côte-Rôtie, but so we can try it here, and maybe it'll work. And they made some lovely wines. But Carrie is going more back to her Alentejan roots, and so she's got the Syrah, and she's still the old vines that she has here are still their old Syrah vines mostly, but she's also beginning to plant some of the Holy Trinity, as you sometimes hear them referred to, of Alentejo black grapes, which are Alicante Bouschet, Trincadeira, and Aragonés, otherwise known in Spain as Tempranillo. And as I mentioned earlier, the other name by which it's known in Portugal is Tinta Roriz, which is what it's called in the north of Portugal, particularly in the Douro Valley. So this one is Syrah and a bit of Touriga Franca, not even Touriga Nacional, but Touriga Franca, which is it's actually a parent, I think, of Touriga Nacional, and there's a lot more Touriga Franca in the Douro Valley than there is Touriga Nacional, although there's a lot of Touriga Nacional being planted. But people have also discovered that Touriga Nacional and Touriga Franca are grapes that work very well, not just in the Douro Valley, but all over Portugal. So all over Portugal, you'll find plantations of Touriga Franca, Touriga Nacional. And so this is here in Corte de Sima, down in the south, in Vidigueira, in the south of the Alentejo. And they've got these Touriga Francas. But Syrah is the historic vine that her mum and dad grew, and she's got that planted mainly. Yes, the Touriga Franca is on granite, because that's what she was looking for. She was looking for a fresh, bright soil and not getting too hot. So this is you have to be very careful when you're working in the Alentejo, because naturally it's a hot place. The temperatures go above 40. And you have to be careful. So if you can find a cold soil like granite, then you're going to slightly mitigate those temperatures, which is a good thing. So it's quite, she's very much going back to nature. I wouldn't say natural wines exactly, but again, she's not using cultured yeasts. She's saying fermented spontaneously with 30% whole bunches. So she's using only the yeasts from the vines in her vineyard. And then she's giving it 12 months in used French oak. So she's not using new French oak for this. This is their top red, by the way. This, and you can see it's 27 to 30 euros a bottle. It's not cheap. But you know, so she's using used French oak in 225 and 500 litre barrels. And then another 12 months in stainless steel tanks. So you've got these two soils, granite and limestone, both of which are quite cool soils. But anyway, so this is the new generation of Cortesima, having been Hans and Carrie for so many years, because they created this vineyard. And now it's their daughter who's taken over. And I met, you know, when we went, Hans wasn't there, nor was Anna, the daughter, but Carrie was there. So I stopped and had a little chat. And she said, yeah, it's Anna now. No, don't ask me any questions. It's all to do with Anna. She's the boss. And I thought, well, good for you. You had the courage to hand over to your daughter and just to steer clear and let her find her own way. I think, I mean, this has got that lovely Syrah perfume. It's sort of raspberries. Oh God, I think this is delicious wine. So it's more expensive than it used to be, because one of the decisions that Anna has made, the daughter has made, is that she's going to make less wine, but she's going to ask for more money. So I'm afraid it's more expensive than it used to be, but there's 15,000 bottles available. So it's not impossible.
We have some comments, Charles. You have some comments in chat.
Someone said perfect for steak.
Yeah.
Oh. And I like, you know, someone likes to use oak barrels. I quite agree. Yeah. I think this will be delicious with a beautiful rare steak. Very good. Made perhaps a steak from Carne Alentejo. Anyway, it's. I think this is. We're going to see a lot more from Cortesima. They've got another property they bought over by the Alentejo coast, which is much colder, and they showed us a white from there, and the white had Alvarinho in there. I thought it was a bit too cool for me, very high acid, and I couldn't quite see where it was going. Maybe it just needs time in the bottle, but I very much preferred the reds they showed, particularly their top red. So they've decided, talking about appellations, they've decided that all their wines will be Vinhos Regionais, so regional wines. They're not trying to go for DOC. I mean, they could be in Vidigueira, they could have a DOC qualification, but they decided to give themselves the flexibility. And actually, Syrah is now allowed within the Alentejo list of approved grape varieties. But they've decided that they want to stay as regional wine, just to give them the flexibility to experiment and do different things. So that's an important aspect. They work in small tanks, and you know, it's so that they can give themselves the flexibility with someone on board like Pedro Parra, who has such good advice to offer. They need to be able to isolate grapes from particular parcels of vineyard and then use those in the blends as they want to. So I think Cortesima, it had rather dropped out of my sight for a little while, but I think now with Anna back on board and Hans and Carrie taking a well-earned retirement, they're going to be very interesting wines coming through, even if they're slightly more expensive. Okay, let's move on to the next wine. And here, this is an extraordinary place. Herdade de Malhadinha Nova. If anyone is contemplating a trip to Portugal to the Alentejo, I really do recommend this. If you're feeling fairly wealthy, if you're feeling you've got money to spend and want to go somewhere really special, Herdade de Melhedinha Nova is an extraordinary place. It was bought by these two couples. It's the Soares family. Paulo and Rita on the left, and João and gosh, what's her second name? João and something like Francesa. She's Margaret on the right, and they are a family whose parents and possibly grandparents, I'm not sure how far it goes, started a chain of wine shops in the Algarve. And it's probably the biggest chain of wine shops in the Algarve now. And they do very well, and they make good money. And there was a point at which they decided they wanted a project, they wanted their own vineyard. And so they looked around the Algarve and thought, we're not really quite sure that we want to do it here. But if we go over those mountains just to the north of here, there's wonderful vineyards to be had at some quite inexpensive prices. So they bought this extraordinary property. It really is amazing. It's 455 hectares in Albano, which is very much the south of the Alentejo. It's between Évora and Beja. Beja is right down in the south. Albano is south of Évora, but north of Beja. So it's the heart of the lower Alentejo, really quite hot countryside. It's not really mountainous, as you can see from this picture underneath. It's sort of more rolling countryside with the odd lake, and there were various buildings that came with the estate, and gradually they've been doing these up and renovating them, and so they now have a series of there's one main building which is where the restaurant is and the main part of the hotel, but they've also got little hotels in these old buildings which have been beautifully redone. It's not cheap. I have to say, we were lucky enough to be invited to stay the night there because we were down in the south of the Alentejo, and we were staying basically up in Évora, but the Soares family said, come and stay the night. And I was very glad they had invited us, because I think the rooms are about 500 euros each for the night. But they are beautifully appointed. It is a lovely place. The restaurant is exceptionally good. It's really luxury accommodation and a luxurious restaurant, which is very much supervised by the consultant chef, who's a man called Joaquim Kerper, who has a restaurant called 11 in Lisbon with a Michelin star. And he supervises the cooking. He's not there all the time, but he's the person who decides on the menus and supervises the cooking. And I have to say, we had dinner there. It was very, very good food. One of the things that Catherine and I have found in Portugal is that you get a lot of food. You know, if you go to an ordinary Portuguese restaurant, there is a lot of food on the plate. And a very big concentration in traditional Portuguese cooking on carbohydrates. So you have bread on the side of your plate, and on your main plate, you'll have both potatoes and rice, because Portugal produces quite a lot of its own rice. So you get a lot of carbs, but you'll also have a large chunk of something protein, whether it's fish or meat. And you don't leave a Portuguese restaurant table feeling hungry. You feel, if anything, slightly the opposite. But at a place like this, in Melhedinha Nova and other restaurants, there's another one. We've got another wine coming up, which is also has a very good restaurant attached. But in places like this, the portions are beautifully judged. A traditional Portuguese might say, there's not enough food on the plate. And I do remember once going with a friend of mine, a winemaker, not in the Alentejo, but a different part of Portugal. And he said, right, I've got a very special restaurant to take you to. And we went to this restaurant, which has just got a Michelin star. And we had, I thought, Catherine and I, we were both there, we had a wonderful meal. It was beautifully done. And at the end of the meal, our host said, wasn't much food on the plate, was there? And that is a very typical Portuguese reaction, but not in a place like Malha Nova. They are so good, the luxury of the hotel. And they've also got beautiful activities for people. They've got a riding school. They've got all sorts of agriculture. They've got the organic vines, many of them. They've got olives, as you'll find most places in Portugal, cork oaks, and then they've got a very good organic herb and vegetable garden. They make their own honey. They've got free-range animals, like they've got black pigs, they've got cows, they've got sheep. They provide an awful lot of what turns up in the restaurant is actually grown or raised on the estate. It's a very impressive place indeed. And it's the second time I've stayed there, but I must say, since I was last there, which was about 15 years ago, they've put an awful lot of effort into doing up these hotel parts of it. And it was very impressive indeed. And they've also, in 2021, they bought another estate up in the Serra de São Mamed, which is a bit north of here. So higher country, Serra Mountain, higher country, so cooler temperatures. And they've only got 4 hectares of vineyard, and they won't plant maybe twice as much again. So they'll end up maybe with about 12 hectares, but so in a much cooler place. And I'm sure they will make wonderful wines. They have an extremely talented winemaker who gave us a huge tasting of wines, Nuno Gonzalez. And we had a really, really good visit. And we came away thinking this is one of those little spots of heaven that if you really had money to spend and wanted to spend time in a very beautiful place, surrounded by nature, you would really have a great time in Arda de Malha Nova. And here I've been talking about the place all the time, and we haven't actually started looking at the wine. So let's move on to the next slide. Here's our slide. And
Charles,
yes, yeah.
Sorry, we have to speed up. It's December.
Okay. I can speed up.
Christmas.
Yeah, Christmas.
Very well.
Okay. Tinta Miúda. Now, that might sound like a very unusual Portuguese grape variety, and it's not much grown, mostly grown here in the Alentejo, but it's known in Spain. It's one of these grapes which is shared between Spain and Portugal. In Spain, it's called the Graciano, which is a very important grape in Rioja. It's important because it keeps its acidity in hot climates. It has wonderful color. So this is Tinta Miúda's single grape variety from Malha. It's one of the ones they try to make into a single grape variety every year. But if it works, it's great. But if it doesn't work, they just blend it into one of their wonderful wines. Quite expensive, over 30 euros a bottle, fermented just in stainless steel. And then it gets 14 months in French oak. Not very high, altitude of 110 meters. So it's not very high, but it's part of that lower Alentejo, quite flat country, rolling countryside. Very good for cork oaks, vines, sheep, black pigs, and going on horse rides if you want to. I think this is a lovely nose. That oak is definitely there. Someone is saying, we must go. You must. It's a wonderful place. Quite firm tannins. I know that this one it will hold. It's got lovely acidity, which Graciano / Tinta Miúda always has. This is a wine you could leave in your cellar for 5, maybe 10 years if you wanted to. There's another single variety, Graciano, that I'm possibly more familiar with than I am with this, which is in Spain, in Rioja. There's a single vineyard called Viña Contino, and they have a single variety, Graciano, same as Tinta Miúda, and that ages incredibly well. So lovely freshness, acidity, a sort of strawberry kind of fruit. Really lovely, and a touch of that new oak there in the barrels. So okay, I will move on. Next wine, we move on. Next place, we move on to Herdade dos Crows. Now this is the other place that has a lovely restaurant too. It's down in the south. Dadish Grosh. Now I was trying to remember what this is what the name is in Polish. I looked it up because a grosh are stalks, or are they cranes? No, they're cranes. I'm sorry. There's a difference between a stalk and a crane. They're both tall, long-legged birds with long bills, but this is gro. A gro is a crane, and I'm not talking the kind of mechanical cranes you use when you're putting up a building or building a bridge or whatever. These are birds, gro, and the Portuguese word, I was told, is juravia. So I don't know if I'm wrong or right, but if you are familiar with juravia as a long-legged bird, that is what this is named after, because there are a lot of them that come through. It's owned by a large German company. They've got 1,100 hectares, so it's not a small estate. It's this large German company, and what they decided was that they bought a hotel to start with. It's a large German financial, it's sort of insurance, financial services. It is big, and they wanted to find somewhere in Portugal which would serve as a holiday destination for their employees, where they could reward their employees for having worked particularly well, do incentives by asking them to go and stay there for a few days, for a week or whatever. Anyway, they bought this hotel, and they called it Villa Vita Park in the Alentejo, which now has a very good restaurant. And I've never been there, but one day I don't get to the Algarve quite as often as I do to other parts of Portugal. But having looked around, they thought, it'd be nice to have even somewhere bigger. And they thought a good investment would be in land here in Portugal. It's really relatively inexpensive. We can buy quite a good slice of land for a very reasonable price. And so they saw this place, Albanoa, again, in the south of Portugal, 17 kilometers from Beja, which is the great city of the south of Portugal, and 1,100 hectares. It's a sort of gentle, rolling landscape. And what they've done is they've made quite a lot of, they've dammed quite a lot of lakes, and there's another winery which has done the same thing. But this is partly lakes, partly the river, and they use this now for a great part of the time. 99% of the hotel space is taken up by employees of this particular company. You could buy the wine, but you can't get to stay there very easily. They do have a few rooms that they let out, and it's a lovely place. But most of it is used by them for incentives for their staff, to just have a good time and be rewarded for working hard. And again, it's a big place, and it's very much, they got free range animals, they got sheep so they can graze the vineyards when they need to. They got pigs, they got cows, local breeds, and they're horse breeding. They offer activities for their guests as well. It's a hotel, and as well as being a wine estate. And again, they've got lots of cork oaks, they've got olive trees, they grow their own organic vegetables and fruit trees, and it's a lovely place. So the wines are very much mix of local and international varieties. So this is the cue to move on to this one. And there you see Alicante Boucher, 100%. Now there were two wines that I really enjoyed at the tasting of this company's wines. One was this one, and one was another one. And it turned out the other one wasn't really available. So we said, okay, let's go for this one. Herdade Grosch, Moon Harvested. Now, what the heck, you might think, does moon harvested mean? Well, there is a certain system of agriculture, and it works in other ways as well, called biodynamics. And one of the things, as far as agriculture is concerned, means that you pick whatever it is you're harvesting. It could be vegetables, it could be vines. You pick at certain times of the cycle of the moon, but also, getting more involved and complicated, the cycles of the planets as well. And you make the decision as to when the best wine is going to be made, and I think it's a German lady who has a list of when you'll get when you're best likely to pick at certain times of the year and in certain different places. Anyway, so this has been harvested, taking advice from an Australian biodynamic company, and it's the consultant winemaker is that guy up there. We're holding up the glass. He's called Luis Duarte, and he has consulted to many different Alentejo wine companies, and indeed more widely in Portugal. He's a very experienced winemaker. And when Luis was asked whether he thinks this biodynamic harvesting would made a big difference to the wine, he said his attitude was, I don't know about that. Don't think so, probably. But it might age better. So, it was a sort of a little bit of a grudging acknowledgement that maybe there was something to do with it. Anyway, they ferment in open lagars. Those are these big open tanks, really open, and it's the kind of thing that in the port industry, you tread the wines in the lagars, so you're foot treading, or sometimes nowadays they have robots to do the treading for you, because it's difficult to get people to tread grapes in the evening after they've been working in the vineyards picking grapes all day. But anyway, foot treading, and they are using these lagars, and then they're running the wines into for the end of the for alcoholic and malolactic fermentation. They're running it into new French oak. Now the question is, do we think this is overly oaky? Yeah, you can smell the oak. Actually, I think this one has a little hint of cork taint. I hope yours don't. Very dark, rich, firm tannins. Alcohol, we're sort of creeping up in our levels. We're up to 14% now. Alicante Bouschet originally came from France. It was imported into Portugal, I think, sometime in the latter part of the 19th century. It was grown in the south, developed in the south of France. It has never made good wines in France. It makes a huge amount of rather boring wines. But in Portugal, it can make some fabulous wines. So it's a bit like Malbec, you might argue, is not as good in France as it is nowadays in Argentina. It's found its true destiny in Argentina. Well, I feel the same about Alicante Bouschet specifically in the Alentejo. It's one of the three great grapes of the Alentejo. The other two is being Trincadeira and Aragonés, but dark, rich, intense, quite closed. I think maybe Luis is right. Maybe it just needs a bit more time, but I think this one has a tiny touch of cork taint, sadly, which is not really going to improve it. However, I think it's a wonderful estate. They've got these marvelous facilities at the hotel, and so anyone who went there would have a fabulous time. But most of the people who go there are employees of this huge German finance company. Right, let us move on then to the next wine. And this is a wine made by Luis, the consultant for that. This is his own vineyard. It's a joint venture between him and his wife, who's called Dora Simões. She, interestingly, is the person who runs the Vinho Verde region.
Sorry.
Yes, Piotr.
Scusi. There's a question about the number 5, Maladinha Nova.
Okay.
Wine. Do you have any knowledge about the importer distributor in Poland? Whether do they have?
The awful thing is, I'm afraid the answer is no. I don't know.
Okay, so we have to ask Thiago about
the
owners.
Thiago will be able to answer the question without question. Yeah.
And the number 6 was corked or not?
Number 6, my bottle of number 6 was just a little bit corked, which was a pity. But I hope that yours all in all the locations were fine. I wouldn't expect this certainly wasn't corked. This is a problem generically with the cork of that wine, I wouldn't have chosen it. So I was just unlucky with the bottle that I had. But I
So
hope
the
you.
other Yola is reporting that theirs was fine. And how many bottles you're allowed to take to Britain now?
Oh, I can take 18 liters of wine per person from the EU into the UK. Which 18 liters? That's a pretty generous allowance.
Yeah, but
Before that happened, before stupid Brexit happened,
guys,
even,
you can imagine the tragedy of this man. 18 liters and one bottle is corked, slightly not corked.
That's life. That's
okay,
life.
let's move on. Yeah.
Okay, so here we are with Luis Duarte. Luis is a very, as I think I said before, is a very experienced winemaker. He's consulted for so many vineyards. Who have I got down on my list here? He consults for Esperão, Herdade do Esperão, which was one of the biggest vineyards in the Alentejo, Montebello, which is one of their brands, and Quinta do Moro, the father of Luis Louro. So he consulted for him. Herdade Grande, which is another very good company whose wines I've been tasting recently. Herdade de Malhadinha Nova. He's their consultant winemaker. And there's another one called Herdade São Miguel, Herdade Servas, Dona Maria, which is the last wine in our tasting. He's the consultant there. He's a really experienced winemaker, but he's only had this business with Dora, his wife, for relatively recently. And this actually, here we got some nice pictures. Nice picture of someone. The cork has just been stripped from this oak and reveals this wonderful dark red color of the stripped bark. It should now takes 9 or 10 years to grow back before they will strip it again. And on the first year they do is they write the last number of the year in which it was stripped, just to make sure they don't go back to it too soon and try and strip it again, and there won't be enough cork there. And here we have a picture of nice granite rocks and a vineyard stretching off into the distance, which is within Luis's vineyards. He's got 12 hectares now, and a small, another little vineyard with a couple of hectares, planted in 2001, 2002. And he and Dora have been very careful. If they came across trees which would have interfered with the rows, they left them. They very much wanted to qualify for this sustainability as soon as they could. You can see the Alentejo Dam, this big dam that takes up quite a large area of the Alentejo, which is a great big dam from a dammed river, and which is providing now quite a lot of the water which is needed to irrigate things like new olive trees, as well as vineyards. And he's very much converting his vineyards to manage without irrigation, because he realizes there is a tremendous pressure on the amount of water which is available for vineyards in the Alentejo with these increasingly dry summers. Anyway, so he's doing it, and he's going back to what the Spanish would call envaso, which means bush vines. They would be called, just clumps of vines, so that they sit, and the leaves of the vines shade the grapes so they don't get too burnt by the sun. And they've changed the position of he's got all sorts of different grape varieties, but this one is Alicante Boucher, which we talked about already, just Touriga Nacional Aragonés, aka Tempranillo in Spain, bit of Syrah, bit of Petit Verdot, and some Tinta Muda, that Graciana we had a couple of wines back. So it's a good mix of different grape varieties, 12 months in 300-litre French oak barrels, and then another 4 months in bottle, and average retail price down 15 to 17.50. So this is one of the less expensive wines in this tasting. But the thing I like about this, it's rich, it's aromatic, it's got a lovely balance, and it's got some that aromatic Touriga Nacional, that herby, almost a bergamot kind of nose, which I find bewitching about Touriga Nacional. I have friends who think, no, they don't like it. I love Touriga Nacional. But But this is it's blended, so it's a more complex wine than just having straight Touriga Nacional. Mm. Mm. I think that's a lovely wine. It makes the most of the fact that it's grown in a sunny place. It's a bit lighter than some of them, 14.5%. So not light in alcohol, but it's got a sort of freshness to it. But then I would expect this from Louis. She's a very, very good winemaker and has been making very good wines for many years. Okay, we better move on. Let's move on then to the next wine. What have we got here? We got a wine from Tiago Cabasso. Tiago is, I've never met Tiago. I've met his mother, who used to have her own winery, and I've met his winemaker, but I have yet to meet Tiago. So I'm looking forward to it. I know he's an enologist who's a Spanish woman who's been working in Spain for many years, called Susana Esteban. And she came to to start with, she came, I'm not sure if it was to the Douro, but anyway, she now makes most of her wines in the Alentejo, and she makes wines for Tiago. Family were in the wine business, and his mum had a restaurant as well. I remember the first time we met her, we had dinner with her in her restaurant, which was in Évora, I think. What was it? No, it was in Estremoz. And it was called, I think, called the Portuguese for the prison, I think. Anyway, it no longer exists. So, and he then decided he wanted to start up on his own, making his own wines. So he built himself a very small winery and started buying grapes from his mum and dad and started making wines and did better and better. And he's done very well. He's sold a few vineyards, bought others, and he has interesting wine names because one of the yes, there you see. So here, concrete tanks, small concrete tanks, beautiful picture of this relatively small winery at the sunset. So you get this idea of this curved shape, not really interfering with the lovely Alentejo scenery, but enhancing it. And then a picture of one of his vineyards, this curved shape. And he has these strange names for some. One is called .com. There's one called .beb. This is relatively conventional because it's just called Vinhos Velhos, which means old vines. So this is old vineyards from his grandfather's vines, which are now about 45 years old, I think. And he's got 40 hectares of those, and it's a blend. It's a field blend. So usually when it says grapes, I would put down what the individual grapes in the blend are. This blend has too many grapes to put them all down, but undoubtedly it will have Alicante Bouschet, it will have Fincadeira, it will have Aragonés. It might have a Touriga Nacional, but it will have lots of other old Alentejo varieties, all in this, because the traditional way to plant vineyards, throughout Portugal really, with the exception of certain places which only had perhaps one or two grape varieties, like Bucelas, which has Arinto. But otherwise, you would plant a mixture of grape varieties. So if one didn't do well one particular year, you can rely on the others. If one gets mildew, the others are probably okay. So that was the traditional way to plant vines, very much in the Douro, in Dão, in the Alentejo. So this is a typical old vine vineyard. And you can see the alcohols are just beginning to creep up now. We've got up to 15% here. He has his own bottling line. He employs about 25 people, locals, but there is also a group of Romanians who now live in Portugal who come and pick for him every year. He likes to work the grapes quite hard, so he does a délestage, this system which you're probably aware of, whereby you empty all the you let run out all the liquid from your tank, and you let it into a tank, and then you dump it all in the top of it again, and it really makes a big sort of impression. It gets a lot of more flavor and tannins out of the grapes underneath. So he's got some very good stainless steel and stainless steel grapes. He sells 70% in Portugal, 30% outside to places like France and Brazil and around Europe, not yet in Poland. So if you like this could be a one for you to pick up. And so old vines will always mean, in my book, there's more complexity. There's always, with old vines, there's sort of quality that you can't quite put your finger on. It's complex, but you're not quite sure why, because there are so many different grape varieties in there with so many different flavors that it's difficult actually to decide what exactly these wines taste of. But it's got this sort of almost a wild kind of intensity to it. Mm. Mm. Again, quite firm tannins, lovely acidity, and this length, and just sort of can't put your finger on what the flavors are, but they're complex, they're bright, they're fresh. You know, maybe 15% alcohol, but it feels fresh in the mouth. It's a pleasure to, I was going to say drink, but I spat it out, but given half a chance, maybe I'll drink some later. And average retail price, 13 euros. So this, again, it's one of the less expensive wines in this tasting. How long is oak aging in total? That's a very good question, and I'm afraid I don't know the answer. The winemaker didn't tell me. Sorry, I would like to have known the answer to that, but I don't know. But lovely, yes, Tinta Muta equals Graciano. That was a question. Yes, it does. It's the same grape variety. Okay, let's move on to the next wine. We've now got Carmim. Carmim. Now, this is a very big winery indeed. This is the largest winery in the Alentejo. But having said that, they make cracking wines. Some of them, it's a cooperative. Carmim is an acronym. It stands for Cooperativa Agricola, so agricultural cooperative, Regengues de Monsaraz, and it seems to get an IM on the end. I don't quite know where that comes from. But Carmim, it's a big place, and you can see this picture of the tanks. These are big tanks behind that glass window, and then that barrel cellar seems to go on for a very long way. It's an enormous winery, but at the top wines that they make, and they make a huge amount of wine. They've got when it started as a cooperative, as I say, when it started there were 60 growers, and it now has 800 members, and between them they farm 3,000 hectares of vines. It's big. Now, because it's a cooperative, they are obliged to take everything that they're given, but if the grapes just are not up to scratch, they say, sorry guys, we're not going to buy these. But otherwise they will take everything. And they have a huge range of wines from very inexpensive to the top two wines, which are this one and one called the, it's called something like the Reserva dos Sócios, the reserve of the members. Anyway, it's Regengues de Monsaraz. It's sort of mid part of the Alentejo. Trifolium is the wine that we're tasting here, and I'm going to get that up now. So it's a blend of the three great Alentejo grapes: Alicante Bouschet, Aragonese, and Trincadeira. Trifolium is also the word that is used to describe a three-leafed clover. You see, now we've got our alcohol has somehow got up to 15.5. So it's a pretty powerful wine here. 185 meters, not very high. Those great big stainless steel vats, temperature control, of course. And then it gets 12 months of aging in new French oak barrels, and then another 12 months in bottle. So it's a very impressive place. We had lunch with the two enologists. Between them, they produce 74 different wine labels, including whites and rosés. And they also make brandy, aguardiente, and they make olive oil because, I mean, these members, they've got olive trees as well as having vines. The main brands are Monsaraz and Regengush. Monsaraz is a small village. Regengush is a sort of medium-sized town. They do tourism. They offer wine tours with guided visits and tastings. And they've got some cracking wines. Their best wine is what they call it's the Garrafeiro dos Sócios, the bottle reserve of the members. And those are really very good indeed. But we decided to go for this one, the Trifolium, which is slightly less expensive, 16 to 18. And they also do a little bit of wine. If you ever cast your mind right back to the beginning of our presentation, there was one shot of tallias, these clay pots in which wine traditionally was made. They do a little bit of making wine in clay pots, which is an interesting and quite fashionable at the moment. But we decided it was a very small amount, so we thought this is silly. Whereas this is a decent amount, over 2,000 bottles. And I just thought this is a huge company, and how wonderful to see a company as big as this making such high quality wines. They are reducing the amount of Trincadeira in the vineyards because they're finding that the problem with Trincadeira is that it can, if it gets wet, which doesn't happen often in the Alentejo, it can get rot very easily. Or on the other hand, if it gets too hot, it will dry out. And so that becomes, then you can't really make decent wines out of it. But anyway, here we are, Trifolium, the Holy Trinity, and you really notice that new oak on the nose, I must say. But I was very taken by this. I thought it was, the other thing, it's a big site, as you can imagine, to cope with 3,000 hectares of grapes. It covers 8 hectares. They've got one cellar for Viña Regional and one for DOC, and then different smaller cellars. It's all stainless steel now, but of course they've got that big that photo of the barrel room, and then they have these clay pots, these tallias. So they can vinify, a few numbers for you. They can vinify 1,500 kilos of grapes a day. They can bottle 21,000 bottles per hour. They have storage for 33 million liters. And you can imagine, harvest is a time for extremely careful control of what's coming in and what you're doing and what you're not to run out of tank space for something which is just coming in. It's a real logistic nightmare. Anyway, let's have a look at this. As I say, quite oaky. But lovely, rich, fresh fruit. I think that's a cracking wine. And to think that this wine, at a pretty reasonable price, between 16 and 18 euros, it comes from the largest winery in the Alentejo, and one of the largest wineries in Portugal, to be honest. I think that's a tremendous wine. I was really slightly worried because I hadn't been there for several years when we went in October, and I really didn't know what to expect. And I was really, really pleasantly surprised. They didn't show us the cheap wines because the deal for this presentation was we wanted to show you in Poland some of the more expensive wines that maybe you weren't seeing at the moment. And so the idea was to not look too much at the cheap wines, but to look at some of the more expensive wines. Anyway, I think that's a lovely bottle. Quite oaky, but if you like it oaky, that's fine. Okay, on to the next wine. Piotr, you've appeared again.
We have two new questions.
Yeah, okay.
Comments in the chat.
Right, okay. So, what is the best pairing for this wine? You know, I would be tempted. There is a dish that is very Portuguese, and it's one of the dishes I really like a lot. It's more the north of Portugal, I think, than down here, but it's a dish which involves. God, I'm just trying to think what it's called. It's a dish of long cooked, not young goat, but relatively old goat. And my clever daughter has just reminded me it's called shanfana. Shanfana, it's long cooked in red wine with onions and garlic and herbs. And it's very much ideally in a closed bread oven overnight. So really, that would be fabulous with this. However, if you don't have a handy bread oven or goats, I think I would be tempted. It's definitely, we're talking meat, and I think it could well be a meat dish cooked in red wine. Frankly, going back to the good old French favorite coq au vin, a good flavor, a well-flavored chicken cooked in red wine with onion and herbs. I think that would be a very good pairing. But my favorite, I think, would be shanfana. Old goat, long cooked in red wine until it's just sort of falling off the bone. Right, okay, next wine, Herdade dos Lagos. The property, herdade means the property, the estate of the lakes. Now, the reason this is called of the lakes is because the family who bought it were called Zeppenfeld, German family again. Although that name, they've married, and so the current family owning it is called Kreichenbaum, another good German name, and they live in Bremen in Germany. It was in a terrible state, this. It would have been ruined by years and years of cereal production, over 50 years. And so the first thing they did, they dammed a river to make a reservoir. And since then, they've made 5 reservoirs. So they've got lots of irrigation, but they've also got a lot of migrating birds, things like, what was it called? Juravia? I can't remember, it's storks, migrating birds. And that's one of the delightful things about the south of Portugal. There is a lot of migrating wildlife that comes through. And it's a real delight. If you find yourself in the right time, you get a lot of flamingos as well, migrating from Europe down to Africa. There are some wonderful bird life. I'm sure that there are companies that do specialized bird tours, let alone wine tours. But there is beautiful, beautiful birds to be found. So it's not a big company, Herdade dos Lagos. You see quite small stainless steel tanks. They made a big thing about renewable energy. You can see those solar panels up there in the vineyard. They've got good ground cover to protect their vines against too much sun. And from time to time, they will mow that. They won't dig it up. They will mow it, and that will then go back into the soil and make some nice mulch for the next season. And when they've picked their grapes, they can run sheep through it, because that's a very sensible way and get a bit of. They've got, I think, 650 sheep, they said, as well as, of course, things like lavender honey. They've got very good olive oils. They've got almonds. They've got carob. I don't know if you're aware of carob. I can't think what the Portuguese name is, but it's that it comes in a sort of long brown bean inside which there are the seeds, which you make the products out of. It's used in the pharmaceutical industry, but it's also used to make an alternative to chocolate, and it's very, very valuable. So it's a very good crop for them to grow. But they've got the sheep, they've got the wine, and their wines have all been organic since 2009. So they're doing very well on that side. And the whole estate has been completely organic since 2012. They are definitely one of the people who have signed up to the sustainable certificate for the Alentejo. And it's about 1,000 hectares, the estate, of which only 30 are vineyards. So it's mostly not vines, but other things like olive trees. It's very much a German Portuguese It's owned by a German family, as I said, Karsten Heinemeyer. No, sorry, he's the consultant. It's Torsten and Antje Kreichenbaum, and their son Janis, who is beginning to get involved. But yes, carob used in baby food, chocolate substitutes, and medicines as well. So it's a very interesting thing to grow. Now, what do we think about the wine? Here we have the Reserva Seleção, the selected Reserva, 15.5% again. So we're down in that hot part of the south of Portugal, the south of the Alentejo, 90% Touriga Nacional, 10% Syrah. So that Touriga Nacional, that herby character of the Touriga Nacional. Gosh, I like that. I seem to have swallowed it. I love that flavor. I'm a bit of a sucker for Touriga Nacional, even though it's not one of the indigenous grape varieties of the Alentejo, but it's making very good wines there. And you see that 15.5% alcohol is balanced by 6.3 grams of acidity, which is with a pretty low pH. So it's done pretty well. And then it gets 18 months in French oak, 3 months in bottle. And I'm not finding that, and admittedly, this is 2019. So it's had a few years of aging, and that's softened it out a bit. And I now just think that it's a lovely wine to drink. I'm sure it will hang on and keep if you want to, but really, for me today, this is a lovely drinking wine. So someone is saying, what's the best pairing? Lamb rump with demi-sauce, demi-glace, perhaps. That sounds pretty good as well. Yeah, maybe a red meat is better than my chicken, my coq au vin. Sorry.
This was the previous wine. Sorry. This was
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. We're now on to the last wine in our tasting, which is going to be from this winery here. Now, this is an amazing place. Dona Maria Wines. Júlio Bastos. That's Júlio in the bottom corner, the bottom left-hand corner. And his winemaker, Sandra Gonçalves, who's been now making wines for Júlio for 20 years. She was a young slip of the thing when she arrived, and they got on well. And it's interesting, I mean, she knows what Júlio likes, and she doesn't really have to take advice from him any longer because she knows him so well that she knows exactly how he wants things done. And it is the most amazing property. As you can see, it's a very grand place. I mean, frankly, in Portugal, this would classify as a palace. And it was actually built, originally, it was built for King João V, who bought it and then made it much nicer. He bought it for one of his mistresses, who was the Dona Maria. And the name of the winery was Quinta do Carmo. Now, when Júlio took over from his father died in 85, and Júlio was in Spain. I'm not quite sure what he was doing, but he was called back to run the family business with very little experience of how to make wine. And so he took advice from, amongst others, Luis Duarte, that very experienced winemaker, and he had some wonderful, I can't remember, yes, you can just see the picture where you've got Júlio standing in front of these lagars. You can see the line of wine workers shredding the grapes in the lagars. You can't really see in this picture, but these lagars are made of pink marble because that's the local stone. How wonderful. And now, over the years, they got slightly grayer from from shredding red grapes in them. But that is where Júlio started. He came back to this amazing property, this palace with a lovely chapel on the left-hand end, and that entrance there is the entrance to the gardens. It's a very grand entrance. It's quite a formal garden, it must be confessed. And then on the right-hand side of the picture, the big picture, that's the winery. So it's all on that level, not too tall, but it's a very, very impressive place. A lot of historic, these lovely blue tiles, azulejos, and It used to be called, as I said, Quinta do Carmo, after its chapel dedicated to Our Lady of Carmo. But when Julio took over, he knew nothing, and he had terrible cash flow problems. He was a bit of a playboy, I have to say, not Luis, Julio in his youth. He lived a good life, but he settled down and he realized he had to be serious, and he started to try to run the business, but he really was finding it very difficult. And so he heard via another of the great consultant winemakers of the Alentejo, João Portugal Ramos, who is now very successful. He has a huge business of his own. But he heard from João one day that the Rothschild family of Bordeaux were interested in buying a property in the Alentejo. And so he got in touch and they came to visit and they did a deal. And eventually the deal they did was they had blind tastings, and there was one blind tasting apparently where they showed Lafite, Chateau Lafite Rothschild 1986 and Quinta do Carmo 1986. And Julio, not surprisingly, said he thought the Portuguese wine was much better than the Lafite Rothschild, but then he would say that. Anyway, in 1992, he sold half of Quinta do Carmo to Domaine Baron de Rothschild, which is the Lafite side of the business. And the production moved to a nearby estate. He kept his palace and the old winery. It wasn't a success. And the French pulled out amazing old vineyards, which Julio was very, very depressed and frustrated by. Lovely old field blend vineyards with a lot of Alicante Bouschet in there, and some of the first Alicante Bouschet that had been planted in the Alentejo. And so he was pretty unhappy about that. And then they started trying to make French winemaking methods and apply that to the Alentejo. And that was the point at which Julio thought, I'm sorry, this isn't going to work. I'm going to have to go my own way. So by the turn of the century, when was it the French arrived in the 90s, by the turn of the century, he decided that he was going to sell the other half to the Rothschilds, and he let the name go because they already had the Quinta do Carmo name, half of it. He said, okay, you can have the Quinta do Carmo. So when you come across Quinta do Carmo, it does not refer to this vineyard, but it refers to the vineyard that the Rothschilds established with quite a lot of French varieties like Merlot and Cabernet Sauvignon that they planted when they first took over. Meanwhile, Julio went back to his own property. He went back to his own vineyards and his own marble lagage. He put in a modern winery and he started making wines. Since then, he's bought another vineyard 8 kilometers away and planted it in 2001. 2002, he bought an old vineyard, over 70 years old, which already had grafted onto it the original clone of Alicante Bouschet that was brought to Portugal in the 19th century. So he replanted the vineyard the French had pulled out, and with that same Alicante Bouschet clone, and he's now got 80 hectares of vines and actually 12 hectares of white, much of which is Viognier, because he didn't find anyone who was prepared to buy Portuguese white wine made from white Portuguese grapes. So he planted Viognier, which actually works very well in the Alentejo. And he has got a very good Viognier called Amantis, after the name of a painting in the castle, in the palace. So the rest is history. The first vintage of this was 2006. So here we are, and we've moved on now to the 2018. This is the Grande Reserva. There is one wine which is slightly more expensive, which is it's called Julio B. Bastos, and that is even more expensive than this. But this one, I have to say, is a fantastic wine. I left this to the end because of all the wines that I tasted, I thought this is the one that I was most impressed by. And So I'll just go and answer this question here. We've got a couple of questions here. Are the amphoras used for aging reds or white wines? Well, the answer is both, actually. And if you're making white wines, you may well put all the grapes into the amphora and ferment the grapes with the skins, which will give you a kind of orange wine. And then the second question was, is it popular to make sparkling wine in the Alentejo? And the answer is not really, because unless you go right close to the Atlantic coast, it's going to be a bit too warm for the best sparkling wines. Yes, you'll find some sparkling wines, but most sparkling wines made in Portugal are made either in Bairrada, up in the northwest of the country, or there's quite a bit of sparkling wine made now in Vinha Verde region, and there are some very good sparkling wines made now in the Douro, in the higher vineyards. So not really sparkling wine in this part of Portugal, in the Alentejo. Anyway, back to this wine. So this is Alicante Bouschet with a little bit of Syrah. I was really looking forward to this wine because I've known it for a long time, and I thought, and Sandra has been there for 20 years, so I've known her for ages. And I thought, I know I'm going to enjoy this. I don't think it's great. It's a lovely wine. It's a wonderful demonstration of how a wine made from a grape variety that really doesn't add up to very much in France can make great wine, because there's not much Syrah there. I can't remember, it's only about 10% Syrah, I think. It's mostly Alicante Bouschet. And this, in Portugal, in this particular place, with old vines, it just makes magnificent wine. Very elegant and complex. You see, they're slightly throttled back from those high alcohols we had for the last couple of wines. So we're back down to 14.5%, which is not low alcohol, but it's less high than the ones we just had before. Mm. And length, there's a little bit of oak in there, because frankly, a lot of this is new oak. Because it can take it. It can sort of swallow that new oak flavor. And it's 2018, so it's had a few years to develop and just soften and mature. And I think this is a great wine. It's not cheap, but I think it's worth its price. And I hope people out there in Poland, you really like it, because I think it's a lovely wine. Piotr.
Well, very elegant and complex wine. Love it. So fabulously intense. Now, not over oaked at all.
Yeah, well, I agree wholeheartedly with that.
At least women. Yeah. Good.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you like that, because I think it's a lovely wine. For me, this is one of the two great properties of the Alentejo. The other is a property called Bouchon, which also makes wonderful wines, based, as it so happens, on Alicante Bouschet as well. But so I'm really glad that you've tasted one of these of the series of tastings we've done with you, because I think this is pretty smart stuff.
Good. Well, so great. Thank you very much, Charles. I believe
a pleasure.
Perfect tasting. And you guys be good, and perhaps Santa Charles comes to you, right? On Christmas or later.
Well, it won't be by Christmas, but we're trying to hatch a plan to come to Poland, which would be great. I've just had a new knee fitted, so that was only about 3 weeks ago. So I'm not moving very well yet, but it'll get better. It's a new knee, it's definitely better than the old knee.
Oh, yeah, new knee, and it's another new knee, right?
Yeah, quite. My second new knee. Yeah, but a different one this time, not the same one.
Not the same one. Yeah, good.
Yeah, quite.
Well, some comments coming. Thank you. Great.
Yeah. Good wishes. Well, thank you so much. And very much the same to you guys out there. I hope you have a wonderful Christmas. I hope the new year brings you many fine bottles and love, good health, happy families, and generally that we have a very good 2024. And let's hope we get a little bit more world peace in 2024 than we've had in 2023.
Yeah.
It hasn't been a very good year for peace.
Yeah, that's a great idea. Good. So and of course the Greek sculptures from Parthenon go to Greece.
Yeah, send them back. Go back to Greece. Send them back. Give them back. They were stolen. I'm sure if they paid money for them, it wasn't nearly enough. Take them back to where they belong, on the Parthenon. That's
very well, guys. Yeah. Charles, thank you very much.
That's a pleasure, Piotr.
Always.
Thanks to all of you. Thanks for taking part. And for those of you who are watching the recording, I hope you enjoy the wines and the recording as well. Yeah. And have a very good 2024. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year and Merry Christmas to all of you.
Yeah, Merry Christmas. We got to get through that first, haven't we?
Thank you. Take care. Okay. Bye-bye. See you soon.
Bye. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye. Ciao.